Hi class, we're going to move on to our next section, which is late antique and Byzantine art. So let's get into it. All right, so we have been focusing on the Roman Empire being this really important foundational civilization for how we understand the Western world, which were considered in the United States and Europe to be the inheritors of this civilization. So when we talk about the Roman Empire, we have this decline in power of the Romans, and there's a lot of debate as to exactly why the Roman Empire declined. I listed here on this slide a couple of reasons some scholars have listed for its downfall or its fall, basically, the way that it's described, which is political instability, economic problems, barbarian invasions. Basically, there's a lot of military fighting back and forth between different groups in the Romans, which weakened the Roman Empire over time. Rome also expanded its borders really far into this really vast empire, which is pretty hard to hold on to for a long period of time. That's another reason that scholars believe that there was a decline. There's also a decline in the cities and the infrastructure. So um, the implication there being that the height of the empire is when you have a proliferation of these things being able to support this vast empire. But when they don't have the money to support those things, that's sort of an indicator of the decline, cultural fragmentation, and also division. But when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, really we're just moving into discussions of the Byzantine Empire, which the Byzantine Empire saw itself as the continuation of the Roman Empire. But really, the way scholars talk about it is viewing Rome and the Italian peninsula as really being the central power at this time. And that gets moved to the Byzantine Empire, which is in modern day Turkey. And we'll look at some maps to get us located exactly where we are. So late antiquity is described typically between 200 to 500 CE. This is a really pivotal moment where, again, this is right around where the Roman Empire is declining in power, but you have the very beginning of the establishment of Christianity as a religion, which eventually becomes the most major world religion in terms of population, in terms of political power, in terms of religious power, economic power, all of those things. So while the Christianity is not at its full force in this time period, this is when Christianity is growing. So it's really important to understand what's going on at this moment because it will lay the foundation for art, culture, politics, religion that will expand and become the overriding power during the Middle Ages. And the Byzantine Empire, and then also into the Middle Ages, really all the way into the Renaissance, and arguably into today, depending on who you talk to, um, depending on how you view the world. So late antiquity is characterized as the beginning. Uh, it's really the late antiquity begins when the Roman Empire is falling, but also with the establishment of Christianity as a major religion in the West. So in the first century CE is when Christianity is founded by a preacher, Jesus Christ, who I assume you have heard of. In 100 to 300 CE, Christianity begins to spread across Western Europe through people who are traveling from Jerusalem, where Jesus was located, where his ministry was centrally located. And then there was people who traveled outside of that and started to spread the word of this figure, this prophetic figure. Early Christians were heavily persecuted by Romans. This was seen as a outside force that was influencing people in a way that was perceived as like a negative for Romans. So this was a religion that was persecuted in order to preserve Roman power. And so a lot of early works of Christianity that we're going to see are in spaces that were meant to be secret, were not meant to be understood maybe super publicly, which is interesting from an artistic perspective because it's a little enigmatic, a little we have to do a little bit of interpretation to really understand the messaging because if it was an overt message, that could have gotten people in trouble. So it's like an interesting thing for us to look at. A lot of the early narratives that we see are going to be narratively driven, meaning that they're going to try to tell stories, specifically things that are found in the Old Testament and New Testament, which are considered the central scriptures for Christians. Emperor Constantine is going to play an extremely important part in the transition from late antiquity into the Byzantine Empire because he's the one that moves the capital, the central location of his empire from Rome to Constantinople, which is in the Byzantine, which is where the Byzantine Empire is founded. And the city originally was called Byzantium, which was a Greek city, but he turned it into the central location of the Roman Empire. Here is a map or a couple of maps to give us an idea of how these territories looked at this time from the Roman Empire into the Byzantine Empire. So if you notice in the oldest map, we have 125 AD. You have the Roman Empire, which is this entire vast empire where this red is outlined, and then Christianity. This is not a Christian empire yet. This is simply Christian influence where it was located, so predominantly in the Middle East, and then makes its way to the West. And then we have, kind of at the same time that Christianity is expanding, the Roman Empire is decreasing in power, and eventually the Roman Empire is considered to collapse when Constantine develops the Byzantine Empire, which again is relocating the Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantium which is located that capital is known as Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, Turkey, if you've ever heard of it. Because we're going to be moving into this period of time where Christian religion is going to take such a hold over cultural production that people are really going to be dedicating their time, energy, and money on creating works of art that support Christian narratives and support Christian ideologies. It's important to understand some of the basic principles or ideas and narratives within Christianity. So, like I said before, a lot of these images we're going to see relate to Old Testament and New Testament narratives, which are stories from scripture, these important religious texts for Christians. Um, we are specifically going to see a lot of narratives telling the story of Jesus, who is the central figure of Christianity. I have a list here of some stories from the New Testament related to the life of Jesus, who is this important figure in the Christian religion. And a lot of these are going to be what we see when we're looking at Christian imagery, stories being told. And I highlighted some of the most important ones because in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking more about Western art. And again, a lot of that is going to basically just be primarily focused on religious themes. So knowing these things are important for our understanding of the images, and also understanding how these specific stories relate to the authority that people establish, like kings and other people in political power using these stories to support their politics, right? Or their rulership, their authority. If you think back to when we talked about ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, a lot of times we saw any sort of leaders would portray themselves with deity around them, right? Because there's this concept that if you associate yourself with deity, it's easier for you to justify yourself in the position of power you're in. So we're going to see the same thing for Christian leadership, Christian monarchs, and things like that. So these purple highlighted, so you can go, on your own time and read through these to get a sense of what these stories are. But the main ones I want you to know because we will be seeing these narratives over and over again in images. So we're going to see an Annunciation scene. Annunciation scene refers specifically to a story of the mother of Jesus being told she was going to bear the Son of God or bear this important person, basically, that she will be this important figure. So that's a scene that we're going to see a lot. We're going to see Madonna or Virgin and child images. So an image of the Mary, the mother of God, with Jesus as a baby. We're also going to see images of the Last Supper, which is this important narrative in the New Testament for Christians about Jesus having dinner with his followers, basically, and being there with Judas, who's the person who eventually betrays him and is the reason he is martyred. And then we have the crucifixion. This is the killing of Christ. You also have the lamentation deposition. This is when he's removed from the cross, which is how he's killed. And then you also have the Pietà scene, which is often a scene of Mary holding the dead Christ's body, or the body of dead Christ. And then you also have a resurrection scene in Ascension, which is basically he dies and then he is resurrected. And then there's a imagery to convey that story. We will also see symbols of the early evangelists. So in early Christianity, you have apostles or followers of Christ, and many of them are represented with symbols. Most specifically, the four that are important to know are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which Matthew is represented as an angel or a man often, Mark is represented often as a lion, Luke is represented as an ox or a calf, and John is represented as an eagle. So if we see these symbols, oftentimes they're a reference to those figures as opposed to just being, just a lion or an ox or whatever, right? They're actually representing something else. All right, so our first work of late antique art is going to be the Catacomb of Priscilla. Now, you have to keep in mind in early Christianity, it was literally an underground religion. It was illegal to practice Christianity in Rome. So it was a religion that had to be practiced in secret. So anybody in early Christian times would have been trying to find safe places for them to practice their religion. So one of the common areas that we know that there would have been meetings and activities for early Christians were the catacombs of Rome, which was this underground network of areas where people were buried. So it was um, literally underground where this religion would be practiced, and it was a really good hiding place for Christians. And this is where we find some of our earliest examples of Christian image making, Christian narratives being portrayed in painting and in art. So it becomes really important because, again, Christianity becomes such a major world force later that, when you look at these early examples of art, we see some of these ideas being carried over into what eventually becomes commissioned by way of Christian art. So the catacombs contain the remains of several early popes and martyrs in early Christianity. So this is a place where there would have been the burial of these important early figures. Priscilla, the name Priscilla or the catacombs of Priscilla comes from the wife of a consul who was, so the consul was martyred, and Priscilla eventually donated the land beneath her villa, this area of the catacombs, to the early Christian church as a place for people to meet and a safe place for Christian art to be commissioned, things like that. Now, remember, because it's a secret area, it's not like these Christian themes were very, very overt. It wasn't, like the writing is conveying these ideas. It's really the symbols that only would have been understood by early Christians. There are different types of burial places here. You have the loculi and the cubicula, and it depended on what class you were in, that be what kind of burial you would have. So loculi are these small niches, which you see in this top picture. That's where most commoners in Rome would have been buried, and then the cubicula or the mortuary chapels was where wealthier people would have been buried, and oftentimes in ornate sarcophagi, which is interesting because sarcophagi are a practice that Romans were using, which is based on Greek burials, which was based on Egyptian burials. So it's an interesting through line that we're still seeing. This chapel you're looking at the bottom is a Greek chapel. This is where Priscilla was buried, along with some of her family members. And it's not a chapel in the sense that this is where people, like Christians, were gathering, but it is where we see early Christian imagery, and inscriptions in Greek, which would have been the street vernacular, like the main language of spoken in Rome at this time. So that's why we see it being named Greek chapel. And we see here that the painting style that has been done, the frescoes here, which, remember, frescoes is this painting style where you paint on wet plaster or on dry plaster, but typically it's on wet plaster, and it gets solidified into the plaster. And so as long as that wall is standing, it's surviving. This is based in Pompeian style, so Roman styles of painting. So early Christian art is heavily influenced by Roman style. So that's important to acknowledge because over time we're going to see that play out again and again, that influence. lasting over a long period of time. And the next couple of slides are some of these fresco paintings that are in this chapel. I encourage you to take a minute and look at these on your own to see if you recognize anything, what you see, what you're noticing, what's different than what we've been seeing thus far, what's similar to what we've been seeing thus far. That'll give you an idea of what Christians were interested in early art making. So that's an important image. This is a very, very important image we're going to talk about in just a minute. See if you recognize, if there's anything you see, if you can make any guesses as to what you're looking at. Here's another important image. Again, get a sense of if you recognize anything here. So on the left, we have the Orant fresco. This is a depiction of a woman. Scholars believe this could potentially be a depiction of like a life cycle. So on the left, you have an image that could be portraying a young woman being married off, which this typically would have been done when you were relatively young. And then on the right, you see a woman holding a baby. This could be a conveyance of motherhood. In the center could be this depiction of a woman potentially like dying or being, ascended into heaven. In a lot of world religions, specifically Christianity is a great example. Oftentimes there's this association with the sky, with like divinity, heaven, some other worldly place. So anytime you see in Christian imagery someone looking up, oftentimes that's meant to be like connection to God or connection to heaven or connection to something spiritual. So this is an example of that. And that word errant is the word for that pose she has, which is meant to be like a worship pose, a connection to heaven pose, connection to God pose, that kind of thing. So this is located over the family tomb niche. So this is like the arch that would have been right over where the burials, like where the bodies would have been buried. It's an interesting construction because you'll notice, sort of similar to the pediments on the Greek temples, you notice that the figures are kind of scrunched at the areas where the arch is coming in, showing that obviously you can't, you had to adjust the proportions here in order for those bodies to fit, which make them disproportionate to one another, right? So we're not seeing something as anatomically correct as we saw in Greek art and sculpture and in Roman art and sculpture, right? We're seeing a little bit less concern with that and more of a focus on like the clothing, a little bit more focus on the narrative scene as opposed to this like technical skill of the artist. Like I said, a theory has been that this is like a life cycle that is potentially didactic, that's supposed to be teaching what like a good Christian life looks like. And the location of the tomb suggests that maybe this is supposed to be a depiction of the person that was buried there being, ascended into heaven, being taken to heaven because, that's what happens when they die. The other image we're looking at, the Good Shepherd fresco, is extremely important because this is a depiction of um, of Christ. And the real reason that it's so important is because some scholars believe that this is the oldest depiction we have of Christ as a figure. We're not positive if this is true. I mean, there's not perfect dating when it comes to these images. But if it is the earliest image that we have or the oldest image that we have, it tells us a lot about early Christianity. And it also lays the foundation for what Christian imagery is going to look like in the future. So the image that you're looking at here is quite, if you think about any other religion we've looked at so far, any depiction of a god of any type, they're typically not portrayed like this. We see a figure that is fairly frugal, fairly pared down. There's not this great athleticism associated or authority associated, right? Like it really is just a humble shepherd. Young person being shown essentially. The depiction of him as a shepherd relates to textual like these allegories that were brought up in the New Testament of Christ being the good shepherd, this nurturing figure, this person who takes care of the sheep, and the sheep would be the followers of Christ. This is with him as this nurturing person, this shepherd, this humble person, and this is going to contribute to the type of narrative that is being portrayed about Christians, early Christians, and about Christ as a person. Around this particular circle that you see here, there's other depictions that come from the Old Testament. This is also a really important thing in early Christian art because there is a specific attempt to make connections between the Old Testament, which is the early scriptures, early texts, religious texts, and with the New Testament, which is the narratives being told about Jesus. So combining the two is Christians trying to make this through line between this earlier religion and the establishment of Christianity in this later era. So the connection between the two is important here, that they're trying to make sure that that through line is really understood. These pictures are good because it shows you what exactly this space looked like. So you can see where the Orant fresco is, right above the niche, right above where the bodies would have been buried. The Good Shepherd fresco is the center of the ceiling. So that tells you a lot too, because that central figure is the Christ figure. And then you have other symbols that surround it, which are like birds, specifically doves, symbols of peace, some other birds that are, again, all of these symbols being associated with Christian ideologies. This is another important early depiction that are found in the catacombs. This is one of the earliest depictions that we know of the Last Supper scene. This is another important story from the New Testament and becomes a very common theme, subject matter for artists, especially during the Renaissance, which is considered to be a very important time period for art in general, but the height of Christian art, really. And so this scene is very important to that lineage of art making. So we're going to be looking at our next work. One of the big themes I want to get across when we're talking about art from late antiquity into the Byzantine Empire is how much is being derived from Roman influences. So I want you to keep that in mind when we're looking at the works that we're going to be looking at, specifically because it's when I say the influence, we're really talking about from an aesthetic perspective, but with Christian themes and narratives being attached to them. So this example we have here is a really great example. I have a video that's going to do a really good job of explaining exactly what I mean about this Roman influence. But this sculpture is based on a Roman version of the same sculpture that depicts Hermes, a mythological figure. But here we see that being adapted to be showing the Christ figure. So we're going to see that theme present itself over and over again. So I just want you to keep that in mind, and I'll be referencing that a couple of times. I also wanted to show you this example of these early Christian sarcophagi. So if you remember, sarcophagi are like basically where people would be buried. And you'll notice a lot of the sculpture work here is very reminiscent of the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus that we looked at at the very end of our unit on ancient Rome. And you'll notice a lot of, again, aesthetic similarities, crowded compositions, figures that kind of look squat, shorter, a lot going on, a little bit of a move away from the interest in perfect anatomy that we were really seeing in ancient Greece and in the beginning of ancient Roman sculpture, and really at the height of ancient Rome. But towards the end, we start seeing some changes. So this is an example of that as well. So now let's watch the video about this Christ statue as a shepherd.
We're in the part of the Vatican museums that is devoted to early Christian art. We've walked by sarcophagi, the covers of tombs from the catacombs, and we've come upon a rare example of early Christian sculpture.
Early Christian freestanding sculpture, that is, everything that we've been looking at pretty much is relief sculpture. And of course, ancient Rome was known for its large freestanding sculptures, but they were associated for Christians with images of gods and emperors, and so not something the first Christians wanted to emulate. There was also the association of worshiping images in the Roman Empire.
This is a marble sculpture, maybe 3.5 feet tall, of the Good Shepherd.
The Good Shepherd as a subject goes back to ancient Greece. There are images of figures carrying sheep or goats on their shoulders to make a sacrifice to the gods. It continues through ancient Roman art and then even here into early Christian art. the meanings change as the images move through time.
This is a period of flux when older traditions are being recast into a new Christian context. And some scholars have noted that the old tradition of Hermes was a perfect figure to readopt. In fact, if we look at this figure, he does have some very classicizing elements. For instance, he stands in contrapposto. His left leg is bent, his weight is entirely on his right leg, his right hip juts up, and the handling of the carving of the folds of his clothing remind us of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture. We often think about early Christian art as poorly proportioned, as poorly carved, but this example shows that those were purposeful decisions, that when artists wanted to represent the figure naturalistically, they could. You have a very sensitive representation of the fall of the cloth. There's a lovely handling of the curly locks on Christ's head or of the sheep's wool. I love the way that the artist has created a point where the Good Shepherd's curly hair meets with the hair of the sheep. There's this wonderful intimacy between the two figures. I also love how the belly of this sheep bulges out just behind his neck a little bit. There's a real sense of the mass of the animal.
And of a shepherd who really is caring for this vulnerable animal, carrying him on his shoulders. And if we look at his back, we can see it's fully carved, and there's a lovely twist in his hips that you can see in the drapery that pulls around toward his left leg, which moves forward. The figure is asymmetrical. He not only stands in contrapposto, but he turns his head to his left, and he gazes out into the distance in a very tranquil way that suggests a perfect life in the countryside. As we walked through the museum, we saw so many images of the Good Shepherd. It's a very common motif in late antique sarcophagi, in relief sculptures. It's usually part of a bucolic, idyllic rural scene that meant on a sarcophagus the idea of a peaceful afterlife, an ideal afterlife. But this is now a Christian subject that for believers in the 4th century, this first century when Christianity is legal to practice in the Roman Empire, the idea that Christ would care for them, that Christ was their shepherd, that death was not final for Christians, but a step to another world, a better world. This is before the portrait image of Christ that we're more familiar with Christ as older and wiser with a beard, has formed. Even just slightly later in early Christian art, we see images of Christ as very youthful, as a shepherd, where the sheep are representative of an extended Christian community.
That Christ looks after as a shepherd looks after his flock. He also herds them towards heaven.
All right, we're going to be talking now about early Christian architecture. This is going to be really important as we move forward anytime we're talking about Western civilization, because when we look at the architecture, a lot of it is going to be based in what starts to develop and becomes the standard of architecture at this particular moment when Christianity starts to boom as a major religion in Europe, and then eventually moving West and East. Anyways, so I want to give a little bit of a breakdown of church architecture, Christian architecture. This image I have here is an axial plan church, which is a very traditional Christian church style that you see predominantly in Western Europe. You'll notice that we have this cross design. So the cross is a very important symbol in Christianity, has associations with Jesus, who was a martyr, killed on a cross. So this cross symbol becomes synonymous with him. So this becomes incorporated in the architecture. Similar to other artistic styles, architecture very much draws its foundational the way things are composed from Roman styles. So Roman architecture is where Christian architecture is really coming from. So what we're looking at here is what becomes Christian architecture, but it is based on the Roman basilica, which we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But just for a basic idea of Christian architecture, you have a cross structure, which is a long rectangular piece with a crossing piece, known as a transept. Typically, you have this longer section in the middle. This is called the nave. This is a big aisleway you have in the middle. Typically, there's like chairs there for congregants. Oftentimes, on either side, you have aisles. This is a way for people to be able to walk up and down the church interior without going through the middle, which where often seats would be located. The narthex is the entryway, and the transept is that cross structure, which just gives it that evocative shape. And at the very end of the church, you typically have an apse, which is oftentimes this sort of like semicircular portion where you have an altar or a sanctuary. This is like where the priest gives, it speeches. There's another word I'm thinking about where a priest gives talks essentially, or there's going to be symbolic rituals that are done there. Like this is really the most sacred part of the church typically, and it makes sense that you kind of come outside from the exterior space, and then as you move forward it's perceived that you kind of get closer to the sacred area of the church. So let's talk a little bit more about we're going to look at an early example of Christian architecture while also talking about how a lot of this is rooted in Roman styles. So the church we're looking at here, well, it's technically not even a church, but I want you to take a minute and look at this structure, see if there's anything you recognize from Roman architecture, anything you recognize from Greek architecture, anything you recognize at all, maybe anything you recognize by way of comparing it to other Christian churches you may have seen before. So take a minute and look at this. This is considered one of the oldest large-scale structures that was used for a Christian context. And again, it's not a church, and we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in a minute. So we don't see a cross structure in the sense that we don't have this rectangular piece with a transept, but we do see this long axial plan, this long rectangular on the floor plan. You can see that. And that is because this building was originally a Roman basilica. And we did look at a Roman basilica before when we talked about the Basilica Olpia in ancient Rome. Um, we don't have like a ton of that left, so we couldn't go in depth into it. But a basilica originally would have been a public space during the Roman Empire that would have been used for lots of different purposes. This long hallway was meant to have a lot of people be able to be in the space. And then the apse, the very end, oftentimes is a place where like an important figure like a judge would reside or something. So that public use where a judge would sit has been transformed to be the religious center of the building. So it's really just being adapted to this Christian context. This is an example of a building that was built by Romans for those public purposes that was taken by Christians and then adapted to be for Christian reasons for Christians, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So this is Santa Sabina. So it's not considered a church because it's technically considered um a martyrium is what it's called, basically a site where somebody would have been martyred. Saint Santa Sabina or Saint Sabina was the person that was martyred at this location. So this location was adapted to be a place of recognition of her sacrifice, her martyrdom. And this Roman basilica was adapted to be used for this martyrium, but it was also a place where they had a lot of examples of spolia. So spolia is a word that anytime it's used in an art historical context, it's basically referring to anytime there's a civilization or someone making a building or whatever, where they take things from a pre-existing place, oftentimes taking it apart and readapting it into a different context. Now, you'll see this quite often in religious contexts, specifically because often there are religions who, while they have political power, are really fighting for like religious power. So by taking the contents or the components of a different building from a different religion and adapting it to yours is a little bit of a way of expressing this idea of like, you've conquered them or that you have shown power over them. So this is an example of that. There are bits of this building that were taken from other structures. So it gives it the sense that, this Christian religion that's taking over is taking precedent and is now above the Roman worship of like the pantheon of gods. That's the basically what they're trying to symbolically pull off here by taking, so for example, if you look at the nave here, you have all of these columns, these Corinthian columns. This was actually taken from a local Roman temple. So, saying, okay, we take these elements of this Roman temple, put them into this Christian martyrium, and then, symbolically speaking, Christianity has conquered, I guess, if that makes sense. So the exterior is quite basic. There's not really like a ton of exterior decoration or anything like that. That will change over time. Christian churches will become very, I mean, the interior oftentimes can be highly decorated, but they also start to focus a lot on the exterior as centuries pass. There's a flat wooden roof with coffered ceilings. This is also going to change eventually in Christian architecture, but this is like a simple sort of early version of Christian architecture. And we have much less interest in geometric forms and defining space, which was really important to Romans. That was really what their focus was on. But the Christians wanted to have something that was more light, airy, spacious, and specifically something tall. They liked the idea of something tall because if something's tall, your instinct often is to look up. And if you're looking up, there's this idea that God's in heaven. So you look up, you're looking to God. There's this sort of symbolism that you experience viscerally, like you physically are looking up. And so it promotes that type of experience. I mentioned the Corinthian columns were recycled. And we do have a lot of mosaics that originally would have been here. If we had time, we would talk about them because they're like quite beautiful. Some of them have been replaced and covered up over time, but they're quite beautiful. We will talk about some mosaics later. Originally, men would have stood at the center of this space, and the woman would have been able to be on the aisles. But there was definitely a differentiation of who could be where. And here's a comparison between the Pantheon and Santa Sabina, just to give you a sense of like the differences in space. I mean, there's clearly similarities. We have the coffered ceilings, we have the use of columns, but the Pantheon is going to have more of a focus on geometric forms, and Santa Sabina is focusing more on an airy space. And you also see that we have clerestory windows. We talked about that in ancient Egypt, which are these windows at the top of like above the archways to let light in so it's not too dark in this space. All right, as I've mentioned, we spent some time on late antiquity, the rise of early Christianity. Now we're going to be moving into the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is very much seen as the inheritor of Western traditions, specifically the Roman Empire. We know that the Roman Empire fell around 410 BCE, and when that happened, the empires technically split between the east and western parts. And then after it was sacked in 410 CE, this is really when the eastern part of the empire is going to flourish. Constantine, who becomes the first Roman leader to claim Christianity, to become a Christian himself, established Constantinople as the new uh, capital of the empire, and it's named after him, Constantinople. And this was established in the Greek city Byzantium around 310 CE. So this becomes the capital of the empire. So this is why we call it the Byzantine Empire, because this is the central location. This is kind of the beginning of that, of the Byzantine Empire being the central location for things that are going on. In the Byzantine Empire, people would not have even considered themselves Byzantines. They actually would have referred to themselves as Christian Romans, because again, that is the inherent. That's what they believed their culture was. They said, I'm Roman, but I'm Christian. So, and this comes from Constantine establishing this as this really important tradition, this important religion in the area. So a lot of what we see in the Byzantine Empire is very much drawing on the Roman past. That means laws, art, architecture, emperors. All of this is really coming from a Roman tradition, but incorporating this new, very important religion of Christianity. So the Byzantine Empire is highly connected because if you look at it geographically, it's actually quite it's located quite well between the western part of what we know as Europe today and the east. So major portions of Asia, basically. So it's very well positioned to be having these interactions with both sides, and we're going to see Roman traditions persist. We're going to be seeing Christian narratives and religion becoming extremely important. However, we're also going to see a large influence from the East coming in as well. And then a lot of people in the East are also going to start adopting Roman tradition. So when we get to, we're going to have some time where we're going to talk about Islamic art and architecture. And this is around the time where the Islamic Empire is also developing and flourishing, and they are going to start borrowing a lot of the things as well from what you're seeing. And there's going to be this interaction between the two, right? Christianity was present in both Eastern and Western regions, and this still impacts things today because we still have vestiges of what we're seeing here in Greek Orthodox tradition. So if you know anything about Greek Orthodoxy, a lot of the art we're going to see is going to be reminiscent of what they still use in worship. So the church and state are one entity still. This is pretty common. And there's a commissioning of vast amounts of artwork. When I say it's common, I shouldn't say that because really the Romans, there was a lot of worship of gods and things like that. But technically there was a Roman Republic established, which was technically separate, the same with Greek democracy. Um, so when we see art being created, a lot of times it was meant to be a form of piety, a form of worship. There was this association that art could be a form of having a religious experience. This is a little different to conceptions of how art was perceived in relationship to religion before. If you think about the Greeks and the Romans, there was more of a focus on offerings and but what we're seeing here is there is going to be a shift in really servicing the glory of God. And then even after the Byzantine Empire falls, like I mentioned, we're going to see a lot of the influence of what we're seeing here manifest itself in the art of this region as well as moving into the East as well, because the Islamic Empire is going to borrow a lot of what we see here, which is Constantinople eventually gets taken over by becomes a Muslim city and gets the name changed to Istanbul, which Istanbul is the current name that it has. So the Byzantine Empire, we can talk about the Byzantine Empire typically between these two or these three major time periods. Early Byzantine Empire, we see a really big outpouring of religious icons, a very intertwined relationship between the creation of art and the worship of deity, worship of God. And so this becomes extremely important. A lot of the art we see is meant to convey the eternal nature of God within Christianity. So there's a lot of use of like limitless space and figures with like attributes like halos, things that are not really like realistic or things that you see in your everyday life, but meant to show them as otherworldly beings. Now, interestingly enough, there becomes this really big controversy around 700, the towards the beginning middle of 700 CE. And at that time, there's this what's known as the iconoclastic controversy. So there becomes this debate within Christianity on exactly what the role of art should be in worship. It becomes controversial and looked down upon to use art as a form of worship and potentially like a problem within the church. So there is this huge amount of iconoclasm at the time, meaning that a lot of people who disagree with the creation of art and using it for worship purposes will actually destroy art. So a lot of the early Byzantine Empire, early Byzantine art that we see actually doesn't exist because it would have been purposefully destroyed in this iconoclastic controversy. Um, this is something that we see in a lot of different religions, and we'll talk about this with other civilizations as well. And then when we get to the Middle and Late Byzantine Empire, there's more art that gets created as well, but we do see the decline of the Byzantine Empire once we hit around 1200 CE. This is when the Latin Crusades are going on. This is when the Ottomans become extremely important, or they start to develop as an empire. And so a lot of what we see starts to decline in power. And we're going to look at the other civilizations that are operating at the same time in the next couple of weeks. This is a great map just to, again, give you a sense of where Constantinople is located geographically. You'll notice that Constantinople is at the very top left-hand side where the star is. But Constantinople was on the Silk Road, and the Silk Roads were these massive trade networks that connected China, India, parts of the Middle East, and there was just these trades going back and forth between the West and the East. And this, and Constantinople is right in the middle, so it's really able to navigate these two spaces and able to get influences from both of these areas. All right, before we move on, I want to take a second and have you do this little activity. I have these four images up, and I want you to, before I give you any info to help, I want you to see if you can recognize anything here. So who or what is being depicted in all of these images? How do you know that? What do you think the purpose of this image would have been during the Byzantine era? Look at the stylistic similarities and differences that you're looking at. Look at the iconography, meaning like any symbols that you see. Are there symbols repeated across these images? What symbols are not repeated across these images? Do you see any changes that happen across these images? And then, kind of a little bit of a leading question is why do you think that visual images like this were so consistent in the Byzantine era? What would that do for a viewer to have them be this consistent in being able to see this type of imagery? So take a minute to think about that and then move on to the next couple slides. All right, we're going to look at our first example of Byzantine architecture. We have been so far talking about the early stages of Christian art and architecture being established and some of the components that become pervasive in the type of art and architecture that's going to be considered Christian architecture for a really long time. This is the foundation of that, right? So this is the time where people are starting to make things, and you're going to see this type of art and architecture repeated over and over again for really hundreds of years after even the Byzantine Empire. We talked about early Christian architecture. We talked about the basilica style and the axial plan style, where you see this cross structure that is, conveys the cross related to Christianity. The example we're going to look at of Byzantine architecture is actually interesting because it's sort of an exception to the rules that we're seeing. Most architecture is going to have this axial plan, but the one we're going to look at near here is a interesting example of a central plan of architecture, but using elements of the Christian cross. So it's kind of hard to explain, but basically what you need to know is that it is very similar to the axial plan that we looked at, which I have a picture of here. But it's just being kind of squinched down together to be in a like central axis, meaning like kind of a circular shape. So you'll notice that you have this cross or this almost circular shape. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have an octagon. I couldn't remember if it was a hexagon or an octagon. But we have an octagon shape with a narthex at the entry point. This is the narthex is very typically the entry point for Christian churches. Then you have a nave area, which is sort of the central area where there's like chairs and aisles surrounding it so people can navigate the space. And at the very in when you navigate the space you're walking through, at the very end of the space that you're walking, there's an apse, which is where the altar would be in this Christian church. And while we don't see this traditional Christian cross shape that becomes synonymous with Christian architecture, we do have a a central cross, which still oftentimes is associated with Christianity. So we see that we do still have that symbolism being used. So the actual work that we're going to be looking at is called the Hagia Sophia. So the Hagia Sophia is a very, very important uh, church that was built by emperors after Constantine, but in uh, Byzantium, the city of Byzantium, which was turned into Constantinople. So this is located in what was Constantinople. Sorry, it's layered. It was Byzantium, and then it became Constantinople, and now it's Istanbul. But at the time that it was Constantinople. It was constructed in this capital city. So it was a massive project. They wanted it to be awe-inspiring. They wanted it to be something that was in this area where people would be traveling to the West, and this would be like their first introduction to the Christian area of the world. So this was supposed to be this massive, spectacular work of architecture. So I have a couple of images. Feel free to take a look and see if you can recognize anything, if there's anything that looks different to you. I will give the caveat that one thing that is important to know is that this was originally a Christian church, was later transformed into a Muslim mosque. So there's elements of a mosque that you're going to see here, which, we've seen examples of that so far, right? We looked at the Pantheon, which at one time was a Roman temple dedicated to Roman gods, but eventually became a Christian church. So this happens, with old architecture, that happens, that there will be different hands that will be in charge of the space. So there will be elements that will be recognizable to us as a Christian church with additions that were added later to make it a Muslim mosque. This is the interior space. You obviously have these really large medallions which have Arabic text. This is indicating that it's a Muslim mosque, but the actual construction of the church was done in order to be a Christian church. So we can look at that and analyze that as an example of Byzantine architecture for to be a Christian church. Here are some other pictures just to give it, take a minute, see if there's anything that you recognize here, in terms of anything that we've looked at so far. I'm hoping that maybe you're recognizing things like domes. We see arches, we're Roman arches specifically. We're also seeing columns. All of that is going from, this Christian architecture being developed is coming from a Roman past, from a Greek past, right? Like these are the things that we've been looking at so far in this class that is building into this new type of architecture, which is a Christian church. So the Hagia Sophia, again, is this large church that was built in Constantinople, which is located in modern day Turkey. This was constructed to be a church. The name Hagia Sophia means holy wisdom. The main part of this church is this massive dome. If you think back to when we looked at the Pantheon again, I mentioned before, this massive dome is very similarly going to be using this type of construction because it's just like a very awe-inspiring construction, have this massive dome in the center. And it's supported by pendentives, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in just a minute. The patrons of this place, basically the people who constructed it, were Emperor Justinian, Empress Theodora. They were leaders who were very interested in promoting art projects that were supporting the Christian, the policy that the empire was Christian, basically. So it's very unusual for its time because it is absolutely massive, as well as the fact that we have this sort of hybrid axial and central plan. Again, a lot of architecture at this time was using this axial plan to be this Christian style of architecture. So the central plan was pretty unique. And just know that that is unique for its time. It's a pretty plain exterior. We don't see lots of like carvings and decoration on the outside of the space. It really is all about the interior of the space, which is fairly common for Byzantine architecture. Often it's going to be a plain exterior with like highly decorated, lots of mosaics, goldwork, that kind of thing in the interior of it. One of the really interesting components of the dome that gets pointed out a lot is the series of 40 tightly spaced windows at the base of the dome. And you have to remember, domes at this time were not architecture. It was hard to pull off. It's not something that was when you're making a dome like this, having those windows would have been immediately seen as something that would weaken the structure. So it's actually like an gives the sense of this engineering miracle. And really the way they pull it off is by these pendentives, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but just thinking about the experience of going to this space and just wondering how in the world can someone construct something like this, because nothing had existed up until this point that looked like this. The columns do bear some influence from Greek and Roman styles. We're going to look at a picture to look at the columns. But they, similar to the windows being at the base of the dome, a lot of the columns are carved to have negative space in them, which gives it this very interesting, like sturdy structure, or sorry, not sturdy structure. It makes it look more airy, which again is really hard to do because columns, domes, all of, a column is a supporting structure and a dome has to have support to hold it up. So when you directly contradict that by making, light come in or a window put in or negative space, it uh contradicts your expectations basically. Lots of gold work, lots of mosaics. We're going to look at some specific examples of mosaics that tell narratives to just get an idea of what these look like, and we're going to look at that in a couple of slides. And then, like I mentioned, this eventually became a Muslim mosque when it was taken over by the Ottoman Empire. And then you had minarets that were incorporated, which we'll talk about minarets when we get to Islamic art and architecture in a couple of weeks. But basically, you'll notice in this exterior picture that you have these huge towers, these four towers. Those are minarets, and that is a addition to make it a mosque. So that would not originally have been there, just the dome portion of it. So this is a really fascinating quote that was written about the Hagia Sophia around the time, a little bit after the death of Emperor Justinian. So, pretty contemporary, pretty close to when it was actually constructed. And it says here, the huge spherical dome makes the structure exceptionally beautiful, yet it seems not to rest upon solid masonry, but to cover the space with its golden dome suspended from heaven. So again, I mean, this is not, these engineering feats that they're pulling off are not just to be, impressive in them of themselves, which they are impressive, but they also give the sense of holiness, spirituality, connections to heaven. Often in Christian scripture, there's an association with light, with religious spiritual experiences. So the idea that this light is coming in gives the sense that this whole space is being, held up by heaven essentially, which is a cool thought that that would have been part of the process of to help people feel these feelings as they entered the space. Here's some examples of the columns. Again, airy. You see the negative, the carving. They literally carved this negative space into the columns, which are a direct contradiction of traditional perceptions of columns, which are supporting structures. So it's a really fascinating contradiction of expectation. Here is another picture to give you an idea of the dome and the pendentive. So basically the way that you want to think about it is, so typically when we've seen domes so far, there's a dome and then you have these walls supporting it all the way down, but they had to be like really thick. But the way that this dome was constructed was slightly different. They actually constructed like basically like a square structure. And then you put the dome on top, like a drum on top of a square, which of course that's at first sounds kind of contradictory because it's like, okay, well, you have a square and then a circle on top. Like, doesn't that like fall through or doesn't like hold it up properly? But they made these really strong pendentive sections of the structure, which is essentially these sections that I have shown here, which would have held up the dome and connected it to the supporting rectangular shape towards the bottom. These would have also been decorated with mosaics. One thing we'll talk a lot about when we get to Islamic architecture is the avoidance of imagery and the emphasis on like text and geometric and abstract designs over recognizable representational imagery. And so most of the Hagia Sophia well, really all of the Hagia Sophia was redone in terms of like the interior, like paint and the mosaics and everything like that, because a lot of it was representational, representing Christian stories and narratives and things like that. So there was when the Ottoman Empire took over, they redid it because they wanted to promote Muslim narratives and stories and things like that, right? But since then, there has been efforts to restore the original mosaics, not everywhere, but in a couple of the areas. So this is an example, the pendentive. There was an attempt to get rid of, it was just like plain gold, basically, and they removed that gold to reveal this mosaic underneath. And this shows like a really interesting seraphim figure, basically like an angel figure, related to early Christian imagery and symbols. This is another example. Just so fascinating. We're going to spend a minute focusing on some of the mosaics located inside the Hagia Sophia to give a sense of what the interior, how it would have been decorated. So take a second and look at this one on your own, see if you can make any sense of what you're looking at, if you have any guesses to who these figures are, and then we'll get into it. All right, so the image that we're looking at is a depiction of Madonna and Child flanked by Emperor Justinian and Constantine, and a depiction of the Hagia Sophia. So we'll kind of break that down. There's a lot going on here, but it's really beautiful and fascinating. So the central figures that you're seeing are the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. So really important figures in Christianity. The Christ being the most important figure, and then his mother, the Virgin Mary. She plays an increasingly more important role as time progresses in this time period of early Christianity. And this is located, or this was made in the 10th century, so around the time a little bit after the Hagia Sophia was constructed. And here you're seeing two uh, uh, figures on either side, and both of the figures that you're looking at here are depictions of emperors. One of them is Emperor Justinian, the other one being Emperor Constantine. So if you know, Emperor Constantine was the first Christian emperor. He established Christianity as the religion of the empire, and he built Constantinople, or turned Constantinople into the capital city of the Roman Empire. And you see him located on the right-hand side of this image. And then on the left-hand side, you have Emperor Justinian, who's the one that commissioned the building of the Hagia Sophia. And you'll notice that they're both carrying something. And Emperor Constantine is carrying a what looks like some sort of stronghold, some sort of wall, construction, maybe like a castle or something. And then Emperor Justinian is carrying also what looks like maybe like a small church. Both of them are holding examples of what their greatest projects were in their life. So Emperor Constantine building, making Constantinople what it is, building the walled city. So there's these crenellations around the city. These are crenellated walls around the city, and so he's showing his work that he accomplished, while Emperor Justinian is showing the Hagia Sophia, which is the church that he built. And this mosaic is located on the Hagia Sophia, which is kind of a fun thing to think about. But it's an interesting idea because basically it's showing that there's these two huge projects that these emperors undertook, and they're offering them to the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, basically saying we're doing this in honor of these deities in order to be good servants to them. So the actual location of the mosaic is over an entryway that emperors would go through when they would conduct specific ceremonies. So it wasn't like a mosaic that was I mean, anybody can go and like look at it, but it's not something that would be like meant just for the public. It was more like meant to show, like, for be used for ceremonial purposes. So it's an interesting idea that this is specifically an image that was mostly directed towards emperors to be looking at. So the image is similar to another mosaic that's located in the Hagia Sophia that I have a picture of on a couple of slides. And yeah, I just have kind of more specifics about exactly you know, who's located on either side. And both of the emperors are wearing imperial lauros, which are basically these really rich sashes that are giving them the sense like of authority. And typically these sashes would have been highly decorated, and they would have been covered in like precious stones. So this would have also been a display of wealth. And oftentimes when you have a display of wealth like this, it has associations with like a display of power. This is a map of the interior of the Hagia Sophia, just to give you a sense of like where this is located. So you'll notice the mosaic on the bottom. This is the southwest vestibule mosaic. So this would have been used just by emperors. Again, this is like not located, right in the center where most people would be seeing it. And then you have this imperial door mosaic that I have on the next slide that we're going to look at. It's just a close-up of the other mosaic that we've been looking at. I like images like this because you can really see the work that went into creating mosaics and how many tiny little tiles it would take to make something like this. And then this is the other image that's located inside the Hagia Sophia that looks quite similar here. So there's like a relationship between these two images that are meant to be seen as like sister images, kind of. And then I have a really great video here that's going to show the process, oops, show the process of how to make a mosaic, what it takes to make these like tiny little tiles and to compose, a composition. So I'm going to add this in to show you that because I think the process is always really interesting.
In the ancient and Byzantine worlds, mosaics were usually found in an architectural setting and not intended as independent, freestanding artworks. Consequently, mosaics were typically created by artisans in situ, or in the exact place they would be displayed. They were popular features in public civic and ceremonial structures, especially baths, but have also been found in the remains of private elite residences. Mosaics were generally set into floors and served as the actual surface on which people walked. Unlike viewing a painting on a wall, a viewer's vantage point would change as they traveled through a room, meaning their experience of the mosaic would constantly change as well. A mosaic is made up of hundreds or thousands of individual small tiles, called tesserae. Tesserae could be made from many different types of materials, often dictated by what was readily available. To stand up to foot traffic, floor mosaics were made of the most durable materials. Colored limestone was commonly used, and mosaicists often gathered scraps from the workshops of builders and sculptors. Marble and granite were also durable, but harder to find, so were more costly. In the Roman and Byzantine periods, an empire-wide trade network existed to acquire these luxurious materials. Mosaicists also sought materials for specific colors and other visual effects. Terracotta was less durable than marble, but provided a good alternative for reds and yellows. Glass tesserae reflect and refract light, creating a surface that sparkles as the viewer's vantage changes. These tiles were more fragile, so were usually only found on walls and ceilings. Semi-precious stones and mother of pearl also added luminosity and texture to mosaics. Today, the art of mosaic making is still practiced by expert artisans. In fact, many of the tools, materials, and techniques they employ are nearly identical to those used by ancient craftsmen.
Here's the next mosaic we're going to look at. This is another depiction of a mosaic that would have been primarily been seen by emperors. That would have been over a door that typically would have been used for grand processionals. The central figure you're looking at here is the Christ figure. You have two figures in these roundels next to him, the Virgin Mary, his mother, and the angel Gabriel. And at the bottom, we have another depiction of an emperor. So let's get into it. So when we look at this mosaic, I wanted to show you this other picture to give you a sense of like exactly where it's located. So you have this grand doorway that leads into the nave of the church, so kind of the primary area. And then above it in the tympanum, which is what it's called, it's this area right above the doorway, is this mosaic. So this would have been seen as you're entering this like liminal, when you're going through this liminal space, basically. So the door, or the other figure that you're seeing here is Emperor Leo the 11th. So this is another emperor that would have been a Christian emperor during the Byzantine Empire. You'll notice that he has a halo around his head, and um, he's actually kneeling on the ground, in this pose. It's proskynesis, I think is how you pronounce it. This is meant to be, you don't you know that word. It's just a word it's meant to tell you that this is an act of respect, someone paying fealty to Christ, showing that this is important to him as an emperor to be this like subservient person to the Christ figure. Um, with his right hand, the Christ figure is blessing the emperor, and on the left, he's holding a book. And on the book, it's actually like fairly largely, here, let me move my little thing. The text is actually fairly largely written, so you can actually make it out. And it says, "Peace be with you, I'm the light of the world," which is a verse from New Testament scripture, which is an important text for Christians. And on both sides of Christ, like I said, we have the Virgin Mary and the angel Gabriel. And really, this is meant to, like a lot of the emperors and a lot of the kings and people in power that we've looked at thus far, there's these connections directly being made between the emperors and their power to the power of some sort of deity. So it's a way, and then he's showing humility to that deity, basically saying, this deity is above me, but I'm still in proximity with this deity, right? Which is going to give authority to them being in power. I had mentioned this before that because the Hagia Sophia is now it for a long time was used as a Muslim mosque and it was turned into a museum in the 20th century, but there's still a lot of elements from being a Muslim mosque. So there's a mihrab, for example, which we haven't talked about what a mihrab is, but we'll get to that when we get to Islamic art. But I just have this slide basically reiterating that a lot of the things that you're seeing here is going to be a mix of these two cultures, which is like a really cool mixture to see the combination of that. And then I have this quick video that gives a little bit of a history of the Hagia Sophia and how it's changed hands a few times. But again, it gives you a really a deep understanding of how over time there's these different empires that come and rise in power, and then they could have probably just as easily destroyed this whole place, but they recognized its beauty and just repurposed the space, which, has been done by lots of different religions, lots of different civilizations throughout time.
They say that if walls could talk, each building would have a story to tell. But few would tell so many fascinating stories in so many different voices as the Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom. Perched at the crossroads of continents and cultures, it has seen massive changes from the name of the city where it stands to its own structure and purpose. And today, the elements from each era stand ready to tell their tales to any visitor who will listen. Even before you arrive at the Hagia Sophia, the ancient fortifications hint at the strategic importance of the surrounding city, founded as Byzantium by Greek colonists in 657 BCE, and successfully renamed as Augusta Antonia, New Rome, and Constantinople, as it was conquered, reconquered, destroyed, and rebuilt by various Greek, Persian, and Roman rulers over the following centuries. And it was within these walls that the first megala ecclesia, or great church, was built in the 4th century. Though it was soon burned to the ground in riots, it established the location for the region's main religious structure for centuries to come. Near the entrance, the marble stones with reliefs are the last reminders of the second church. Built in 415 CE, it was destroyed during the Nika riots of 532 when angry crowds at a chariot race nearly overthrew the Emperor Justinian I. Having barely managed to retain power, he resolved to rebuild the church on a grander scale, and 5 years later, the edifice you see before you was completed. As you step inside, the stones of the foundation and walls murmur tales from their homelands of Egypt and Syria, while columns taken from the Temple of Artemis recall a more ancient past. Runic inscriptions carved by the Vikings of the emperor's elite guard carry the lore of distant northern lands. But your attention is caught by the grand dome representing the heavens. Reaching over 50 meters high and over 30 meters in diameter, and ringed by windows around its base, the golden dome appears suspended from heaven, light reflecting through its interior. Beneath its grandiose symbolism, the sturdy reinforcing Corinthian columns brought from Lebanon after the original dome was partially destroyed by an earthquake in 558 CE quietly remind you of its fragility and the engineering skill such a marvel requires. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, the mosaics from the next several centuries have the most to say, not only about their biblical themes, but also the Byzantine emperors who commissioned them, often depicted along with Christ. But beneath their loud and clear voices, one hears the haunting echoes of the damaged and missing mosaics and icons, desecrated and looted during the Latin occupation in the Fourth Crusade. Within the floor, the tomb inscription of Enrico Dandolo, the Venetian ruler who commanded the campaign, is a stark reminder of those 57 years that Hagia Sophia spent as a Roman Catholic church before returning to its Orthodox roots upon the Byzantine reconquest. But it would not remain a church for long. Weakened by the Crusades, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453 and would be known as Istanbul thereafter. After allowing his soldiers 3 days of pillage, Sultan Mehmet II entered the building. Though heavily damaged, its grandeur was not lost on the young sultan, who immediately rededicated it to Allah, proclaiming that it would be the new imperial mosque. The 4 minarets built over the next century are the most obvious sign of this era, serving as architectural supports in addition to their religious purpose. But there are many others. Ornate candle holders relate Suleiman's conquest of Hungary, while giant calligraphy discs hung from the ceiling remind visitors for the first 4 caliphs who followed Muhammad. Though the building you see today still looks like a mosque, it is now a museum, a decision made in 1935 by Kemal Atatürk, the modernizing first president of Turkey following the Ottoman Empire's collapse. It was this secularization that allowed for removal of the carpets hiding the marble floor decorations and the plaster covering the Christian mosaics. Ongoing restoration work has allowed the multiplicity of voices in Hagia Sophia's long history to be heard again after centuries of silence. But conflict remains. Hidden mosaics cry out from beneath Islamic calligraphy, valuable pieces of history that cannot be uncovered without destroying others. Meanwhile, calls sound from both Muslim and Christian communities to return the building to its former religious purposes. The story of the divine wisdom may be far from over, but one can only hope that the many voices residing there will be able to tell their part for years to come.